When it comes to capturing compelling portraits of animals, I've already covered in my last tutorial the importance of good quality light, the usefulness of direct eye contact, and the worthwhile goal of trying, where possible, to reveal something of the subject's character, their personality. What I should have made clearer perhaps is that these are simply suggestions, ideas, things for you to consider when you're out with your camera. I will never tell you what you must do photographically, what rules you must adhere to, and I would encourage you to ignore anyone who might. My desire for this channel is simply to give you as much useful information, as many ideas and options as I possibly can. Anything that I can think of that makes your photography easier, more productive, and more enjoyable. So today, whilst we will look at the next 3 important elements in capturing compelling animal portraits, in highlighting how useful certain elements could potentially be, I will then immediately offer some contrasting examples to act as a counterbalance. This is important because I want to illustrate that within wildlife photography, the only definitive, the only inarguable, is that we must always protect the well-being of the animal, bird or insect with which we are working. Everything else is largely subjective, and it is here that the unique creative beauty of photography resides. For those of you who stay until the end of this video, I want to share with you some visually quite dramatic, compelling but graphic images. They do not show any active predation, nor animal suffering of any kind, but rather the aftermath of the natural passing of a hippopotamus and its consumption by scavenging hyenas. Nevertheless, the resulting images might be unsettling for some, and so before I reveal those images later, I will be encouraging those of a sensitive disposition to consider looking away. Though obviously I hope that you don't, as I value your opinion and I would love to hear your thoughts. Welcome back to the channel everybody, my name is Andy Parkinson, I'm a National Geographic photographer, a Nikon Europe ambassador, and today we are doing the second part of animal portraits with impact. Shooting at eye level is undoubtedly one of the most definitive mantras in wildlife photography, and it is so for good reason. This technique can be effective for many different reasons, such as creating a more intimate feel, where the viewer is eye to eye with the animal, a feeling of inhabiting their world and experiencing the world from their perspective. And the difference in simply just lowering your shooting position, often by just a few inches, can have an absolutely transformative effect on your images. This is because often, but not always, it makes the backdrop more distant and therefore easier to throw out of focus, especially if you use a wide aperture like f2.8 or f4, or in the case of this bear cub, f5.6. Using a wide aperture means that we are also able to concentrate the viewer's attention more on the subject, but I must admit that this kind of blurred foreground, blurred background, slightly sterile, one-dimensional images I personally like the least. They just don't have enough vision or creativity about them for me. They feel cliched and hackneyed, and yes, I agree that whilst they are undeniably effective, they rarely engage me or get me to think, wow. Instead, my reaction is one of ambivalence, indifference, even to my own images. There are, however, creative interpretations with this technique, which we'll look at those later. So let's not write off wide aperture eye level photography completely just yet, because if nothing else, they can be particularly effective as front covers. Sticking with the usefulness of eye level for now, I just want to reference one particular circumstance where you can use a much narrower aperture like f8, which creates more depth of field, but still create quite graphically striking images, like with this unusually curious brown hare. Because of the extensive snow cover that year, the landscape close to where I live was rendered as a pristine white canvas, the hares in their winter coats looking their very best. As such, I was able to photograph the hare at f8, at ISO 1600 and with a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. The reason that I was able to, or chose to shoot at f8 is, when photographing against a pristine white backdrop like this, there is little or no distraction in the background for me to bring into focus, And so by photographing an f8 and therefore increasing the depth of field, I have more protection for situations where, as I have done here, frustratingly dropped the focus at the most critical point. It was shooting at f8 and having greater depth of field that has kept this flawed image usable. Had I been photographing at just f4, then the hair would have been too far out of focus, and as painful as it would have been, I would have had no choice but to end up deleting it. It was the two chosen variables of my aperture at f8 and my necessarily fast shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second that determined that I had to use a comparatively high ISO of 1600. I typically keep a fast shutter speed when I'm working with brown hairs because whilst they can remain inactive for hours, they will suddenly display explosive aspects of behaviour. Keeping my shutter speed high means that I am more responsive, more reactive to when circumstances suddenly change. In terms of the exposure, then again, with these winter hairs, this was another circumstance where I was shooting using manual exposure for two reasons. The light was consistent, being bright overcast, and the amount of light on the subject was consistent. So whether the hairs are tiny in the frame, like these distant boxing hairs, or if one is suddenly filling the frame, the exposure will remain the same. Had I chosen to shoot these two encounters in aperture priority, or AV, then I would have had to be constantly adjusting the exposure compensation to accommodate for the hair's increasing or decreasing size in the frame, and therefore the proportion of light and dark in the frame that the camera is trying to interpret. In this situation in particular, the camera would have been giving widely variable and therefore inaccurate results. By photographing using manual exposure, my brain was liberated, free to concentrate only on accurate focusing, which to be fair I occasionally messed up, or on composition, which in this situation was relatively straightforward. Again, this is not an instruction for you to photograph only in manual, just an explanation from me detailing my process and my thinking and what I use in individual circumstances. If your exposure technique is serving you well and you are getting consistently accurate results, then stick with it, absolutely. But if you are struggling or even panicking in the pressured or challenging situations that wildlife photography can sometimes create, then perhaps it is worth considering a more streamlined approach to exposure, one that potentially frees your mind to focus on just one variable rather than three. This subject, of course, will require an entire tutorial dedicated to it, so that is one for the future. This mountain hare image, on the other hand, shows what can happen if you don't have quite enough depth of field. My focus on the eyes is accurate, but do you find the out of focus nose a little too distracting? Or did you not notice it until I just mentioned it? There is a constant balance and struggle trying to ensure that the relevant parts of the subject are critically sharp, without bringing distracting elements of the background into play. I personally think that the curious, quizzical look of the hair adds sufficient interest to the image to make up for the shortfall in the depth of field. But what do you guys think? It's the same issue with this leopard female. Sharp eyes and a fuzzy nose, and whilst I assumed in hindsight that this was an error, looking at the ISO it doesn't look like I had a lot of latitude, so for this flaw I have to be philosophical. Lastly, of course, shooting at eye level does not always create conveniently blurred backgrounds because sometimes the backdrop is simply too close to the subject. In these kind of scenarios, you simply have to react organically to the best of your ability. So I did what I could to create some fractional separation between subject and foliage. Compositionally, you'll see that I rarely leave a lot of foreground or dead space. And again, this is due to my mantra of, if it detracts, then exclude it. I see so many images posted online where there is an excess of messy, cluttered and pointless foreground that adds nothing to the image. Learn to look at every individual aspect of your image and ask yourself, what is its role? What is its purpose? Is it adding something useful? If not, then get rid, either in the moment or in post-processing. So, to reiterate, Whilst seeking to shoot at eye level can be a good idea, it is not a rule, nor should it be blindly followed. Fantastic images can be captured from all perspectives, and so you should always remain flexible in your thinking and in your outlook. My objective with this channel is to give you as many ideas and insights as I possibly can, as many tools in your arsenal, and to serve as a consistent reminder that those who encourage you to stick blindly to dogma are to be ignored. No decent, imaginative photographer would ever say, "Always do this." With that in mind, let's now quickly look at a few effective images captured from different perspectives, to remind ourselves to always remain open-minded and flexible in our thinking. In this image, I had spent several hours in the pouring rain, lying next to a hare named Beardy, waiting for him to actually do something, all the while acclimating him to my presence. Only because of this investment of time was I then able to rise, painfully slowly, to my feet, framing him tightly by shooting almost vertically downwards from less than a few feet away. At such close proximity, where the effect of depth of field is markedly minimised, I had to close down my aperture to f14 to ensure that all of him was in sharp focus. This way, when global recognition came knocking for him on the contents page of National Geographic magazine, he could look his soggy, bedraggled best. In addition, had I photographed either of these caimans at water level or eye level, this first one with the widest aperture of f2.8, then I would not have been able to show the textured ripples in the water's surface. Contrast the previous image at f2.8 with this second one photographed at f22, and you can see the startling but often subtle role that aperture and the resulting depth of field has in creative wildlife photography. Similarly, with this lounging hippopotamus bathing in a small tributary of the mighty Mara River, it was the downward-looking riverbank perspective that made this graphic, slightly abstract image possible. For future reference, it was a hippo that had passed away, likely of old age, in a small river like this, that led to the hyena photos coming up at the end of this video. Next up is photographing full frame. Now this is one of my favourite approaches, but it can only be realistically achieved in limited situations, especially with animals. Either the animal has to be one that has the potential to be incredibly confiding, like this mountain hare, the legendary Mrs. Gray. Now remember what I said moments ago about proximity reducing the effects of depth of field. Looking at this image, you could be forgiven for believing that this was captured with a wide aperture, like f4 or f5.6. But this was actually captured at f13, so just look at how quickly the focus drops away beyond her eyes and nose. So remember, if you're lucky enough, privileged enough, to be able to share such proximity with a wild animal, then you'll likely have to close your aperture right down, like I have here, to try and bring all of the critically important parts of the subject into sharp focus. Otherwise, you're going to end up with very sharp eyes and a very out of focus nose. So photographing full frame then makes a mockery of the idea that when trying to produce compelling or eye-catching portraits, you must always photograph with a wide aperture. Virtually every image in this section is photographed using the opposite technique, with the aperture closed down. So to do this, you have two choices. You'll need to either reduce your shutter speed, which I wouldn't recommend, as proximity also significantly magnifies the effect of any movement that the subject might make, like with this hair grooming. Or you'll have no option but to increase your ISO to make your sensor more sensitive to light, but this of course also has the potential to degrade the resulting images by making them noisier. As always, photographic decisions require careful balance, but it is always better to have a sharp image with a little bit of noise than it is to have a soft image without. The second scenario where you can potentially shoot full frame is working with very large animals like elephants, but I am of course aware again of the privilege of being able to work with such creatures. I know that for the first 20 plus years of my career, working with such exotic species like elephants was never a realistic option for me, nor indeed was the final option for shooting full-frame portraits, and that is shooting again with reasonably accessible subjects, but with a super telephoto lens like a 600mm f4 or, which I have now, the new Nikon 800mm f6.3. Acquiring this lightweight, great value lens has been a game changer for me, and I look forward to sharing some of my recent images with you over the coming months. My motivation for shooting full frame is many and varied. My primary motivation is usually the uniqueness of the opportunity, largely because I encounter such moments less frequently. Another motivation would be to exclude messy or cluttered backdrops like this one, where, on arrival, the adult male bear greeted me with this friendly and affectionate smile. It was trying to exclude the backdrop of the bright, distracting highlights of this mountainous river that led me to compose this detailed but arguably unconventional close-up. A triangle of interest that leads the viewer's eye from the paws of the bear to its contemplative eye, and then onto the matted fur on its neck. Cropping out fundamentally important parts of this behemoth was a necessary evil. The distracting highlights of the river behind had no place in this image. This location is one where, with an 800mm lens, I can, if a bear decides to come close enough, allow me to produce images like this. Yet another bear image where it is the whites of the eyes, the sclera, that act as the focal point for the viewer, the hook. This sclera is something that is shared with our own social species, something that allows us a better insight into how each other is feeling, a means of communication, and is perhaps why I am so drawn to favouring images where it is visible. This brings me on to the final reason for choosing to shoot full frame, and that is the beauty that can be found in the detail. This might be patterns, textures, or aspects of anatomical interest, like the terrifying teeth of a caiman, which are just so relentlessly compelling to photograph. Here, the temptation to go in really tight was too irresistible. The caiman, on a similar plane of focus, meant that f11 was enough to create critical sharpness throughout on my 800mm. It might also be the equally captivating paws of a Kamchatka brown bear, so versatile and varied, interesting enough to command a frame all of their own. The bear's stoic, steady feet remaining motionless over the course of a near second-long exposure. And this is where we reach the final aspect that is worth considering in the quest for impact portraits, and that is the inclusion of your own unique, subjective creativity. I have a genuine passion for this final element because I think that my brain works in a slightly unconventional way, and I always shoot with what feels right. I would then always encourage you to do the same. With digital cameras, we are freed from the financial cost of experimentation, and your only limit is your imagination. So shoot whatever appeals to you. If you can only see part of the animal, shoot. If the animal is moving away, take the image. If you see a pattern or texture, then try to isolate it and build the entire image around a recognizable part of the subject by simply including something that is familiar, be they features or character traits. Perhaps in post-processing, whilst always maintaining the authenticity of the original image, you can process it in such a way that you can accentuate certain physical attributes or environmental conditions whilst allowing other parts of the image to fade into obscurity. This image took me 15 years to capture, from when I first saw the idea to when an appropriate opportunity came along. But even though I was forced to use an aperture of f5.6, the background and foreground are still completely diffuse, the snow-covered ground contributing to the impactful nature of this portrait. Again, it is the diffuse nature of the subject's surroundings that made this ideal for a front cover. I understand that this might be a polarizing image, and some can rightfully say that it is compositionally flawed because I have omitted the head. But this is how I photographed it in the moment, because to me the image was always the towering, formidable scale of the bear, the dripping, sodden fur, and those massive claws. Showing the bear's face to me was superfluous and unnecessary. Compositionally, it would have also weakened the image, as the paws would have felt even more isolated at the bottom of the frame, whereas this way they can occupy a higher relative position. So now for the trigger warning. The last few images could be considered confronting, but all of them I think have an important narrative, so if you are squeamish, then thank you so much for watching, and please do consider subscribing. Producing these videos is incredibly time consuming, and channels like mine can only continue with your support. Adult male lions have a unique menace about them, especially when they are busy with the process of protecting their kill. I don't know whether this lion was even acknowledging me or our vehicle, but his gaze still holds the viewer's attention. With the hyenas, as the feeding frenzy began, so I decided to try and record some of the motion, 1/8 of a second enough to show some movement, but also to retain some sharpness. When the shutter speed increases, so the horror of the long dead hippo unfolds. But this is the role of hyenas, this is what they do, and their role is so important. Remember, this hippo died of natural causes, and though formidable predators in their own right, on this occasion the hyenas are simply scavenging. The final image shows that even confronted with this horror, creativity can still be found. The menacing, familiar shadow of an adult hyena cast onto a carcass, the smell of which will live long in my memory. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the images. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.